Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. 5. Nocturne. The passengers of the Orion usually retired early. Occasionally, Dr. Wordsworth and Dr. Eisenstein lay out on the small back deck for half an hour or so, their deck chairs pulled out from under the shading canvas so that they could study the stars. They were very serious about this, and it seemed to Simon that they forgot to notice the beauty of the night sky. But this night they were in their cabin early, Dr. Wordsworth brushing her black tresses with the ritual tea. Dr. Eisenstein, in brown cotton bathrobe, looked up from her notebook. "Inez, what on earth do you mean by saying that you don't play bridge? You know you play a far better game than I do." Inez Wordsworth did not deny this. "I just don't want to play with that bunch." "Why? What's wrong with them?" "Oh, Ruth, the Smiths are thousands of years old. I got a peek at her passport. She's 81 and he's obviously older. They're sweet and all that, but they're dull old fuddy-duddies." "What about fair?" Dr. Wordsworth knew how to swear picturesquely in a good many languages. She brought all of them into use while Dr. Eisenstein put down her pen and notebook in amazement. A slow tear trickled down Inez Wordsworth's cheek, and she wiped it away furiously. "My God, to think I was once in love with that desiccated fop." "Oh, my dear," Dr. Eisenstein cried. "I'm so sorry. How dreadful for you." "Forsyth, forsooth," Dr. Wordsworth said and blew her nose furiously. "At least it does begin with an F." You can't mean Mr. Fair is Fernando." "Aren't you being a trifle slow? Fernando Popeyes, Fernando or Forsyth Fair, FP both, and Popeyes does mean fair in English. And for him, I went to jail. Is it so surprising that I tried to put the past behind me?" "My dear," Ruth Eisenstein said slowly, "of course it is behind you, but it is not good to bury things. They will always erupt, and in that way they may even destroy you. I hate to see you in pain, but I think that it may be a very good thing for you to come to terms with the past. It will always be part of you, and unless it's acknowledged and put in its proper perspective, it will always be able to hurt you." Dr. Wordsworth lay still in her bunk, looking away from her friend. Dr. Eisenstein put away her notebook and pen and got into bed. Still looking away, Dr. Wordsworth said, "You may be right. Thank God I am going to La Guaria. I'll be better when we get to Lago de los Dragones with your Cristianos. Perhaps it will do me good to talk about the past. I know you want to help me. I'm very grateful." "Nonsense!" Dr. Eisenstein turned out her light. The curtains were drawn across the portholes, and the room was dark and stuffy. That morning, Geraldo had folded their blankets and put them on top of the wardrobe. Dr. Eisenstein thought of turning on the fan and decided it was not quite warm enough for her thin blood. Through the darkness came Dr. Wordsworth's voice, back in control. "Thank God my father was English. My temperament is basically far more Anglo-Saxon than Latin." Dr. Eisenstein barely stopped herself from laughing. "We have been colleagues for nearly 20 years, and I have yet to find an Anglo-Saxon trait in you. You've always been deceived by looks. I meet a situation with reason. That is an Anglo-Saxon trait. The Latin crashes into everything with emotions. And that," said Dr. Eisenstein, "is a generality." Janton Zwick, still in his white uniform, sat at his desk and finished tallying the day's accounts. His cabin was hot, and the fan did little to cool it. His blood, unlike Dr. Eisenstein's, was not thin, and he was disturbed. He decided that he would go up on the boat deck, where Dr. Wordsworth walked laps, and that he would stand in the breeze for a few minutes before going to bed. He locked the drawer where he kept money and records, left his cabin, crossing the foyer and walking down the port passageway so that he would pass the cabin with the Bolivar portrait. As he went by, he put his hand against the handle, but the door, as usual, was locked, and the handle did not move to his touch. He had keys to all the cabins, but he did not go in. No use risking further unpleasantness. Umar, he thought. Umar, why should a Quistano name be written on the back of the portrait? What else is written there? If that one board had not come loose as we were carrying the case into the cabin, I would never have seen that much. What possible reason could there be for a Quistano name to be written on the back of a portrait of Bolivar that was given to an American? Umar. It is very strange. Perhaps I will talk about it to Mynheer Boone. In his tiny cabin next to Polly's, Emmanuel Theoctopoulos prepared for the night. He read an act of Romeo and Juliet, an inept play. Then he turned out the light. Within easy reach of his hand, and the cabin was so compact that anything he might need was in easy reach. It was a worn music manuscript of Bach organ preludes and fugues. He knew them so well that it was unlikely he would need to refer to the music. He lay on his back, his mane spread out on the pillow, and let the music fill the cabin. He heard it as he himself had played it during his many years as a cathedral organist. The small cabin grew and expanded until harmony and counterpoint overflowed the ship and spread out into the ocean. He felt relaxed and at peace. He looked forward with joy to Emily Gregory's first public concerts. He felt little anxiety. She was a superb musician with the depth and power of suffering behind her technique, a musical wisdom far beyond her age. He looked forward to taking her to some of the great restaurants, to being proud of her. The girl, Polly O'Keefe, just growing out of gawkishness, reminded him of his pupil, despite Emily's black hair and Polly's flame. But they were more or less of an age, moving into adulthood with a kind of steel-spring stubbornness and an otherworldly innocence, almost as acute as that old-fashioned boy's, Simon's. He was both surprised and annoyed to have the great strands of the fugue broken thus by thoughts of the girl he was sailing across the ocean to hear, of the 3 children on the ship. He was, for no logical reason, worried about his 3 young traveling companions, and since Mr. Theo was both a Greek and a musician, he paid attention to such illogical notions. He sat up in his bunk. "I am too old to be bothered with children, and there is nothing wrong. They are all quite safe. Dr. O'Keefe is a loving father as I've ever come across. And Mr. Fair treats young Simon as though he were a piece of Venetian glass. Fair, humph. There was something odd going on about that, on around that bridge table." He pushed the unwelcome thoughts away, went back several phrases in the music to pick up the theme, lost it again. It was not only the niggling, irrational worry about the children, or a sense that there had been unexplained tension at the bridge table that was interfering with the music. It was the heat. He realized that they had moved into sultry weather, and he was damp with perspiration. He had always disliked hot weather. Why hadn't he had sense enough to get on a ship with air conditioning? He hated air conditioning, that's why. The cabin was too small. Even with the door open, the drawn curtain kept out the breeze. The little fan did no more than recirculate warm air. He decided to go out on deck. Dr. Wordsworth was right. They were eating too much and exercising too little. He would make several laps around the deck. It would not be as good exercise as playing a great organ, but it would have to suffice. Charles sat in his bunk, lotus position, and watched his father getting ready for bed. After Dr. O'Keefe had finished brushing his teeth, and would therefore be able to respond, Charles said, "Are you missing Mother?" "Very much. Polly and I miss her too." "I know you do, Charles, but you're enjoying this trip, aren't you? We're having a fabulous time, but you can have 2 very different feelings simultaneously. You miss her differently from Polly and me, don't you?" "Yes." Dr. O'Keefe pulled on his pajama bottoms. "And the kids. Polly and I miss them, but that's different too." "I suppose it is, Charles." Dr. O'Keefe turned on the fan over the wash basin. "And I guess they miss us, but it's really a good kind of missing because we know it's only for a month, and then we'll be together again, and maybe we'll love each other more because of not having seen each other all that time." Dr. O'Keefe stretched out in his bunk. "Maybe we'll appreciate each other more, but I doubt if I could love your mother or any of you kids more than I already do." "But love always has to grow, doesn't it?" "Yes, Charles, you're quite right." Dr. O'Keefe had an idea that his son was leading up to something, so he lay back and waited. When Aunt Leonis dies, what will happen to Simon? I suppose his cousin Forsyth would take care of him." Charles was silent for so long that his father decided the conversation was over, without really having gone anywhere, but Charles said, "There's something wrong about Cousin Forsyth." "Why do you say that?" "I don't know, I just know it, the way I know things sometimes." Dr. O'Keefe did not contradict his son. It was quite true that occasionally Charles knew something in a way not consistent with reasonable fact. It was odd, and it was disturbing, but there was no denying that it happened. "What do you want me to do, Charles?" "I don't know. It's all vague and foggy. There's something wrong, and I don't know what it is. I wish we weren't getting off at Port of Dragons day after tomorrow and leaving Simon alone with Cousin Forsyth. I'm afraid, Daddy." Dr. O'Keefe did not scoff. "It's not till day after tomorrow, and I'll keep a close eye on both Simon and his cousin in the meantime." "Thank you, Daddy. If the worst comes to the worst, could we stay on the ship till LaGuardia?" "I doubt it, Charles. Let's hope there's no reason to." "All right, I'm not sleepy. I think I'll go talk to Polly for a few minutes." "Please don't worry her about this, Charles." "I wasn't going to, but it's hot tonight." When the boy had left the cabin, his father stared at the ceiling for some time, thinking. Charles's intuitions were too often right for comfort, and he found himself wishing, along with his son, that they were not leaving Simon with Cousin Forsyth when they docked at Port of Dragons. There was something unpleasant about Forsyth Fair, despite his rather Latin courteousness. That bridge game, for instance, it seemed to Dr. O'Keefe that Fair was baiting old Smith and enjoying his discomfiture, but why? It also seemed to Dr. O'Keefe that Fair had taken uncommon trouble to learn about his fellow passengers. "I know that I am well known in my field," he thought, "but Fair knows more about my experiments with starfish than I would expect a layman to know, and I think he suspects that I am going to Dragon Lake for more than my own personal interest in marine biology. But Fair," he hoped, did not know that in one section of Dragon Lake, starfish were no longer able to regenerate when they lost an arm, or that on shore there had been reports of death as a result of industrial effluents poured into the lake, or that there were rich and ruthless industrialists who would resent interference. He picked up an article on mercury poisoning and tried to read, but he could not concentrate. Had he been foolish to bring Polly and Charles with him on this journey? Was he bringing them into danger? Had he, in his single-minded devotion to science, underestimated the greed and brutality of those whom money and power are more important than human life? He must warn Polly and Charles again, not to mention that they were going to Dragon Lake at the urgent request of Venezuela. Mrs. Smith was preparing for bed, brushing her soft, sparse white hair. She took out her dentures and placed them carefully in a dish of water in which she had dropped a cleansing tablet. Mr. Smith came through the curtains in the doorway. Mrs. Smith, toothless, lisped, "Say, Odell, where have you been?" "On deck, having a cigar." He began to undress, folding his clothes carefully. Mrs. Smith hurriedly cleaned her dentures and fitted them back in her mouth. When she spoke, her speech was clear, but her voice was tremulous. "Odell, you made too much of it." "Too much of what?" He folded down the top sheet and lay on his bunk, reaching for a paperback novel set in Costa Rica. "Playing for a penny a point. It sounded as though..." "As though what?" "We lost last night. It sounded as though you didn't want to pay if you lost." His mouth set in a rigid line. His voice was tight. "I can't, Patty, not even..." She sat on the side of her bunk and looked at him across the narrow width of cabin. "Everybody thought it was strange." "You mean Forsyth Fair thought it was strange?" "All right, but he did." "I'm sorry, Patty, but I'm like an alcoholic. You know that. I cannot and I will not start gambling again." "But you're cured. It's been over 50 years since..." He looked at her over the book. "Patty, you know it cannot be cured. That you, of all people, should want to tempt me." Her soft lips trembled and quick tears rushed to her eyes, which were magnified by heavy cataract lenses. "I'm sorry, Odell, I didn't mean, but I thought the past was over and that we could forget it. And one fear got the better of the other. If Mr. Fair should make the connection..." Mr. Smith snapped. "I have been gone from the bank and back in the United States for 10... I had been gone from the bank and back in the United States for 10 years before Forsyth Fair came to work in Caracas. Everybody on the ship knows we are going to Costa Rica to visit our granddaughter and her family. It's a pleasant trip for us, and we've been looking forward to it for months. There's no reason anybody should think of Caracas in connection with me at all, or even know that we ever lived there. You're just imagining things. Mr. Fair will get off at Liguara, with his precious portrait of Bolivar, and we can forget it, as though it has all been a bad dream. Mrs. Smith got into her bunk and picked up the baby's booty, now almost finished. Oh, Odell, I hope so. I hope so. You paid back every cent of the debt. You've had a good name all these years. Oh, Odell, why does it have to come back to hurt us all over again? Captain Peter von Leyden was on the bridge, but ready to turn the helm over to lie off Boone. The sea was calm. He expected no difficult weather conditions, and the report of dragons was clear. The radar was void of disturbance. Not even a fishing boat marred its serenity. Lyle Boone looked at his captain. Van Leyden's face was frequently stern. He ran a tight, albeit happy ship, even though he permitted the guitar and flute and the sound of singing as long as the work was done, and well and promptly done. He seldom smiled or sang himself. At this moment he was frowning, not in an angry way, but as though he was worried about something, and he did not immediately hand the vessel over to his subordinate. Boone checked the radar, found no cause in sea or sky for anxiety. He had learned early that it was not wise to ask questions of the master of the Orion, so he continued to look at the ship's instruments, finally saying, "An interesting group of passengers this voyage. They are pleasant enough from our usual elderly types. I like the children. They are happy, not spoiled or noisy." Boone agreed. "The girl isn't much now, but give her a few years, and should have every sailor looking at her." "A few years and a few pounds," the captain nodded. "Geraldo seems to find her already attractive. Perhaps we should have Jan speak to him, though I do not think Geraldo will overstep." "Geraldo is Latin," Boone grinned. "Latins always overstep." Von Leyden turned away from the wheel, and instruments paused at the dorsal and moved back toward his second-in-command. "There is one passenger." Boone waited. It seemed that Van Leyden would leave without completing his sentence, but at last he said, "I will be glad when we reach LaGuardia." "Not that I have anything to fear personally, but I have met Mr. Forsyth Fair once before, though I think he did not have the same name. It was on my first voyage." He paused. He did not see the sudden look of surprise in Boone's eyes. He made life extremely difficult for the master of the ship. There was another long silence, which Boone broke at last. "He does not seem unusually demanding, quite the contrary." Van Leyden shrugged. "On my first voyage, I was only a seaman, but I had eyes and ears. Mr. Fair went to the authorities when we docked at LaGuardia and made accusations about carelessness in accounting for cargo. In the end, it was impossible to prove that my captain had tried to pocket money for oil well machinery, but it was also impossible for him to prove that he had not. However, I knew my captain. He would never have been caught in any kind of petty thievery or smuggling. The matter was dropped, but my captain wrote out his resignation as master of his ship. I will never forget the look in his eyes as he said goodbye to us all in Amsterdam, and we knew he would not be going to sea again." Silence fell once more. The Orion slid quietly through the night. Van Leyden went on. "The young man made a public apology. If I was mistaken in this matter, I am truly sorry. But we all knew that there is considerable dishonesty over cargo. I did not feel that this was an adequate apology. I loved and honored my captain." Boone asked, "How on earth did you recognize him after all these years, particularly if the name is not the same? Are you sure?" "I would take my oath on it. One does not easily forget one's first voyage, especially such a voyage. The mustache is the same, and the nose and the jaw with that deep cleft. There is the same look in the eyes. The moment I saw him in Savannah, that first voyage of mine flashed before my eyes. I do not think I am mistaken." "Only a few days more," Boone said, "and he will be gone. But why would he have a different name? Many men find occasion when a change of name is helpful." "True," Boone agreed. "I can think of one or two myself. Perhaps I should tell you a rather strange thing. Jan Tenswick came to me a few minutes ago. An old story of a Quistano name painted on the back of Fair's portrait of Bolivar, not just any Quistano name, one of Jan's names. He seemed very concerned over this. I told him that it was probably no more than a coincidence, and asked him if he was absolutely certain of what he had seen. Apparently, a board came loose on the crate as they were carrying it into the cabin, and he saw Umar written there. He said he went back later to verify this, and Mr. Farr came into the cabin and was extremely angry and disagreeable. I thought the whole business totally unimportant, but under the circumstances, perhaps it is wise to mention it. The captain sighed. Are there still rumors that the Quistano treasure is somewhere around the Lake of Dragons? There are always rumors. The treasure of Dragon Lake is the lake itself, the oil, but it is not colorful enough for some imaginations. It had not occurred to me that Jan might be wondering about the treasure, but that is possible. He told me once that the Quistanos are awaiting the return of some Englishman who fought with Bolivar, fell in love with a beautiful Quistano girl, and disappeared. They've apparently learned nothing from the Aztecs, but I don't pay too much attention to his Quistano fairy tales. The captain turned to leave. His face moved in one of his rare smiles. I am just happy that we are not carrying an Englishman with us. He looked out to the horizon where sea met sky, and no land was to be seen dividing water and air. In any event, I will be glad when Mr. Fair leaves the ship at La Guara and takes his portrait to Caracas. I would like to know how he got hold of such a portrait, and what he is being paid for it. I understand he is giving it to the Bolivar Museum in Caracas. People like Mr. Fair do not give away valuable things for nothing. And we will pause there.